Good evening. Welcome to Talk Gnosis. Tonight we are going to continue our discussion on the Gospel of Thomas, and tonight we are discussing verse 15. Good evening, Bishop Peterson.
Good evening, Bishop Canterbury.
How would you like to go ahead and start off our show by reading this verse to our listeners?
I will do so. Jesus said, "When you see him who is not born of woman, fall down upon your faces and worship him. That one is your father." Okay. So that's short and sweet, isn't it?
It's very short.
Now, the interesting thing is I was doing some background on this because the term born of woman, you hear it sometimes in colloquial conversation. In Job 14:1, he speaks of being born of woman as a normal human condition and part of the daily grind. Now, the other thing that's been pointed out by some commentators on this verse is that there doesn't seem to be a parallel verse to this in either the canonical New Testament nor in the Gnostic scriptures. Marvin Myers does note that the Manichaean Psalm book does associate the Father with one who is not born, and then there is also some Gnostic traditions where you have the unbegotten, somebody who's not been begotten. So one of the interesting things for me here is Jesus in this verse separating himself from the Father who is worthy of worship. Because Jesus it was born of woman. As a matter of fact, and this is asserted throughout the canonical New Testament at least, Galatians 4:4 asserts that Christ was born of woman. So we have that tradition there that, that Christ was born of woman. But now the interesting thing in 1 Corinthians 15:45, Jesus is associated with Adam. The first man, Adam, became a living being. The last Adam, Jesus, a life-giving spirit. Now, of course, Adam was not born of woman. So it makes me wonder here where there are some different ideas about being born of woman within the early Christian community. Was, for example, did some people deny that Christ was born of woman, or did they believe that, for example, Christ was born a physical man, but that he incorporated the Christ spirit at a later date, which was unbegotten and not born of woman? So there it's kind of a messy situation here, but we do have Jesus saying, one who's not born of woman, one who is not born by normal processes, he's the one that you fall down and worship. He's your father.
Yeah, I've always been a little, I guess, perplexed, by that particular text, because there does seem to be a little bit of contradiction there, because as you've stated, I mean, the Gospels pretty much are filled with Jesus is born of the woman. I think, even the casual observer to Christianity could tell you that Jesus was born of Mary, of the Virgin Mary. So on one hand, I mean, we do have that, but I guess I wonder, is there something more to that? Is there something a little bit more hidden? Does this refer to simply as, the eternal spirit, the Christos, that then had descended into the physical? Is this what is being referred to? Something that has existed before the birth of the human Christ and its eternal spirit? And does it then even refer to our own spirit, our own immortality, our own oneness with the pleroma?
And that could very well be. I mean, there have been some commentators of a more esoteric bent who have spoken of this as a psychological process, that you're tapping into something inside yourself. And I don't know that I necessarily agree with that, and I'm not entirely sure what that Thomasine community would have understood this to mean, but that is one way that some commentators have chosen to deal with this, is that you're acknowledging something that's eternal inside yourself, something that was not born, but there's something that is internal that's connecting you with the higher spirit that you come to recognize as being God. That is one explanation. I don't necessarily agree with it, but that is one thing that I have read.
Well, I find it interesting, when it says in there, bow down oh, where does it say? Bow down face to the earth and adore him. He is your father. Again, the kind of that, I think that idea of the father, in many kind of Gnostic ideas and schools of thought, we've got this idea of this unknown God, of this unknown father, who is almost alien to that of the material universe, of what is known. We could probably go back into some of the Hebrew concepts of Ein Sof, Ein Sof hour, and go back to kind of that unmanifested not being, of which all possibilities exist, which I think does have some close ties and similarities to kind of that Gnostic concept of this unknown father, that which is not known, that which kind of existed before the material universe came into existence. So it's kind of a very tricky verse. I think it definitely needs a lot of meditation. It needs a lot of thought. But I think there's multiple interpretations on this. Whether it is for our own spirituality, or is there something directly that we were being told by Christ, and what does this mean?
Well, as you were just talking there, Bishop Canterbury, you got me thinking about, okay, this unknown father, this unknown father. Now, the interesting thing is, Jesus is saying, when you see him who is not born of woman, fall down upon your faces. When you see him, how the heck are we supposed to recognize something that's unknowable?
Mm-hmm.
And there's a sense in which Jesus is intimating that we're going to be able to recognize this, or can we? He's saying, when you see him, well, I see people all the time, but I don't necessarily recognize them for who they are. Is it possible that there's a process before you can get to that point where that you are such that you are able to eventually recognize him who is not born of woman? Because that you're going to have to be able to recognize that. And if we're talking about something that is beyond our normal comprehension, that recognition is going to be important. Otherwise, you may just see somebody, but you have no idea who they are.
Yeah, interesting. I'm just looking at some of these notes in here. And I guess one of the thoughts I was having on this is that, in some way, do we think that this could have even been a kind of a manifestation of even separation, at least within this particular sect who put together this particular text, of possibly even separating themselves from other schools of Gnostic thought. For an example, we have some of the early sects who kind of followed the ideas of John the Baptist, and he was definitely born of a woman. But now, are we sort of making that manifestation of Christ being born of spirit? Yes, physically, maybe he was born of a woman, but we're saying the part of him that was Christ transcends that of human birth. And was this a way of maybe separating themselves from maybe that school of the Baptist? Again, just more questions,
Yeah, more questions. But I think that you're using an important word there, Bishop, and that is separation. That may be a key here, in the sense that it was Christ, quite possibly, and we don't know, because the one problem with Gospel of Thomas is we've got all of these isolated sayings. But was he suggesting that there was a separation within himself? And that was considered to be an old heresy. The idea that Christ's earthly bodily nature was different from his spiritual nature, but it's one possibility. But yeah, so we're left with this. Who is this person? How do we recognize him? And how are we supposed to be able to recognize him? If there is somebody who is perhaps, and if this is part of that tradition of there being an unknown God, an unknown Father. How the heck would we get to that point where we could even see and recognize that individual?
And that's if it's an individual. Again,
Yeah.
what this is referring to is basically our own hidden God, if you will, that's manifest within us. The kingdom of God is within. I mean, we see that within the Gospel of Thomas. So what if this is simply about, once we come to that realization of the kingdom of God is within, and within that own divine Father who is manifest within inside of us, and not something external, not necessarily pointing to him and say he is your Father, but once we come to that realization of what the Father actually is.
Yeah.
There was a note in here. I'm looking at one of the sources of notes on earlychristianwritings.com, and there was a visitor's comment on there that I don't know who the individual was. They did put an initial of L. Jewel, so we will give them credit for this. But I thought this was an interesting note in here, that it says, perhaps it is the ego that is born of a woman, that when we come to know that which is all, that which is not born, but is, that which defies the illusion of separateness, that our born egos endures, that we should worship that.
Ego that is born of a woman. That's interesting. Let me go in there and have a look. We can get into this in the podcast afterwards too. But
absolutely.
But it's interesting because the ego, I tend to associate the ego with who we think we are, rather than who we actually are.
Right. But again, what defines us and what we actually are? Is it simply our physical selves, our flesh, our blood, our bones, our hair, our skin? It could always be argued. If I chop off my arm, I am still Ken. If I chop off my other arm, I am still Ken. It's not our physical parts that define us on what we are. It's that internal spirit.
It is, and I think we're also in the process of becoming ourselves, or we can be. That is a possibility that is offered to us. It's the ability to become more and more ourselves, rather than being attached to, again, who we think we are. And incidentally, who you think you are is not the person that the people around you know and love. Just reminding people of that. I think that's important. And I think also that I don't know that this is anything. I've read a couple of things that have suggested that this may be a misogynistic text. I don't think it is. I think the phrase "born of woman" is just simply saying one who was born through the natural process of procreation. I don't see anything in here that suggests otherwise. Again, it's so short, but it's an interesting thing. Now, again, the more that I'm reading this passage, he says, when you see him who is not born of woman, fall down upon your faces and worship him. That one is your Father. It's interesting that he puts that one is your Father, identifying who you're worshiping at the end rather than at the beginning. He's not saying, when you see him who is not born of woman, that's your Father, so fall down upon your face and worship him. The word order may be important here. That the idea of this process of perhaps the necessity, recognition, falling down and worshiping, and then identification.
Interesting.
There may be a process there.
I even just find it just kind of those last few words at the end, that one is your Father. If I separate the rest of the verse, and sometimes I do this when I'm meditating and studying scriptures and various verses, is that I separate them into various sections and try to take each section individually. And even though this is a very short verse, even though just that one little part that's separated, that one is your Father, that if we get rid of the rest, that one has lots of implications, I think, in various things that are spiritual. And what did that necessarily even mean to those who were walking around in the first century? What was their knowledge of Hebrew mystical traditions and the meaning of one? To a Hebrew, was it the letter Aleph, and what did that signify? the modern Kabbalists may say, well, that is the path between Kether and Chokmah, and we can give it all sorts of various attributes and what one or Aleph may mean. But I think that there is definitely, if you start breaking this down, there can be some pretty deep spiritual significance that I think we definitely need to continue in Talk Gnosis After Dark.
I think absolutely. We're running out of time, so I know, Bishop Canterbury, you and I wanted to discuss something very briefly, switch up the end of the show a little bit.
Sure.
We wanted to talk about, obviously this week has been a difficult one for many people, and there's been a lot of focus on the issue of depression, mental illness, and suicide. There's also been a lot of really bad news in the news. There's been a severe case of injustice in Ferguson, and there has been community response to that. There have been things going on overseas that are extremely troubling, and when you bring all these things together, it can be really hard on people. And fortunately, people are starting to talk about the issues of mental illness and depression. And I know that you and I, Bishop Ken, want to make people aware in the esoteric community, or anybody who is watching this certainly, but those in the esoteric community in particular, that you should and seek help for your distress if you are experiencing depression, anxiety, or having any really very negative feelings that are bothering you, that are impacting your life. There is help available, and just because you're on a spiritual path does not mean that you should not seek or receive help. It's very important that you do.
I couldn't agree more fully. I think, unfortunately, sometimes if one is suffering from various mental health issues, that there's a certain stigma around that. People are sometimes afraid to open up. Some people are afraid that may show signs of weakness, that it shows lack of character. Unfortunately, society has not done a very good job of supporting those who suffer from such things as depression. I actually did a post up on my own Facebook page last night talking about my own issues with severe depression and anxiety disorder, which I myself have battled for the last several years. And myself, even at one time, which may be of shock to the viewers, had contemplated suicide myself, even sat there with a bottle of scotch and a bottle of Ambien sleeping pills in front of me, debating whether I should take my own life or not. So it can affect anyone. It doesn't matter of one's social status, of one's spiritual status, of one's economic status, race. Mental illnesses knows no barrier, and I would encourage any of our viewers, if they have an issue, seek help. And for any of our listeners who are not experiencing these things, but maybe have friends who they see these symptoms in, encourage them to seek help. Be their friend. Show them support. Show them love. These are all things that are extremely necessary, and if we can help prevent even one more unnecessary death, that would be a beautiful thing. I'm amazed when I look at the numbers to how many people commit suicide every year. I mean, the numbers are mind-boggling.
Yes, it's about, and in fact, I think the last statistics came out in 2011. It was about 35,000 in the United States. So it's serious. If you are in need of help, immediate help, the National Suicide Prevention Lifeline is available to you 24/7, 1-800-273-8255. If you prefer, you can actually go to www.suicidepreventionlifeline.org, and you can actually chat with somebody if that's what you feel more comfortable doing. And there's also a great deal of information available on that website to friends and loved ones who want to know how to be supportive. So we wanted just to bring that up today. We know it's been a tough week for a lot of people, and this has actually been a tough year. We've had a lot of bad news this year, internationally and nationally, and it tends to wear on people. So we want to make sure that people are aware that there is help available.
Absolutely. And I know several months ago we had an excellent host, or excellent guest who is one of your friends, and I think maybe in the near future we need to have him back on and discuss again some mental health issues specifically within the esoteric community, but I think also in a broader term, because I think it's something that all can benefit from.
Absolutely. It was Alan Salmi. He did an episode, I think it was back in October, called Therapists for Esotericists.
Mm-hmm.
And it was on, I actually have posted this to the Talk Gnosis Facebook page. And so you can go in there and just, watch the video there, but also you can go into the YouTube archives and find it there. But it was an excellent presentation by somebody who's a clinical social worker. And hopefully we'll be having him back on the show to talk about these issues some more.
Fantastic.
All right. Well, thank you so much for joining us this evening. And we're going to be doing the After Dark podcast afterwards. And if you are a Patreon patron, you will be able to sit in on that podcast recording. We're looking forward to doing that. And if you have enjoyed our show and found it helpful, you can support us at patreon.com/Gnostic. You pledge a small amount per video or podcast, and everything that you pledge directly supports the development of this program. And of course, we always appreciate your feedback. You can find us online. You can leave messages in the YouTube comments or send us an email at talkgnosis@gnosticnyc.com. So thank you very much for joining us. And Bishop Ken, it was great seeing you as always.
Thank you so much, and good night, everyone.
Good night.
Thank you.